Well everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at the Samsung Galaxy Note 9 and see if this device is still worth buying in 2023. Now, I will definitely tell you, I love the Galaxy Note 9. I think it was one of the most, not maybe the most impactful Note phone of all time, but it was one of my favorite, and even back in 2018 when this thing first came out, it was a very good looking phone, and now even in 2023, 5 years later, this is still a very good looking phone for sure. So I probably wouldn't recommend buying this phone right now, but if you want to buy some phones I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now starting off with the outside of the Samsung Galaxy Note 9, we do have a beautiful build on this phone. So on the front, we had a 6.4 inch Super AMOLED display. It was a 1440p panel, and this was the moment in time in which Samsung still only made one Samsung Galaxy Note phone. They only made the Samsung Galaxy Note. They didn't have a Note Plus or a Note whatever. They may have had like the Note FE one time, but that was kind of a rare example. They basically only had one flagship device that was a Note phone. Since then, they've kind of had two, and really there's only been two successors to the Note phone since then, and then like a spiritual successor in a way. With the Note 9, this was it. This was what Samsung threw everything they had into the phone basically like later that year, and it's a beautiful thing that Samsung did. I always liked the Note phones for sure, and the panel of this thing was very good. Curved sides, flat, not a flat display, but kind of a rectangular design which looked beautiful. A little bit of bezel on the top and bottom. I think this phone looked beautiful, and even now it still looks very good. I will also say that a lot of phones are kind of looking more like this because of that, kind of rectangular curved side panel. I would argue that the S22 Ultra looks more like this than like a Note 10 or a Note 10 Plus in my opinion. So in terms of that, and in terms of the front, it just definitely still looks beautiful. On the bottom, you do have a headphone jack, which is pretty crazy. You have a USB Type-C port with Samsung DeX. That is another awesome thing. And you have that S Pen. That S Pen in and of itself was a really nice touch that Samsung threw on here. Again, with all their Note phones, they've had it. The S22 Ultra has brought it back, which I love seeing. And, although I didn't really use the S Pen that much growing up or even like recently, it is still a nice thing to have. Just kind of throwing a stylus on your phone is super cool. And I wouldn't be surprised if more manufacturers don't start doing this. I'm surprised it's been like this for years because this is such a nice feature. Now, on top of that, you also had a micro SD card slot on this phone. This was, I think, one of the last Samsung Notes to have a micro SD card slot. I know the Note 20 Ultra may have had one, but this was the last one where it was like consecutive. Like every single phone before this and this one also had it, and all besides the Note 5. And that's another thing that I kind of loved about the Note 9. It had everything. You didn't have to buy this phone and have to give up anything at that moment. Nowadays, there are some outdated aspects of this phone, but at that moment, this was a crazy good phone. And on the back of this phone, we had our standard glass back, so nothing super fascinating or crazy here, but still happy this thing had that glass back on it. You had that dual camera setup at the very top, which is cool. You had your standard fingerprint sensor behind or underneath that camera. You also had a wireless charging on this phone, which is great. You had IP certification on this phone too. So this phone still had a lot going for it, like it wasn't just like a super outdated phone. I still think it looks and performed fairly decent at that moment. And I think those are some big things to keep in mind. When you have a phone like this, even in this day and age, in my opinion, it's some pretty decent, stuff to kind of have on a device like this. So when it comes down to it, the build quality of this phone, it definitely gets a thumbs up for me, and the hardware of this phone on the outside. Now in the camera department in more detail, this phone, like I said, dual camera setup, 12 megapixel wide angle lens, and then a 12 megapixel telephoto lens. And on the front, you had an 8 megapixel wide angle lens, and then you actually had a 2 megapixel iris scanner, so it's kind of like a dual camera on the front, but not really. And what I'll tell you about this phone is, back in 2018, this was probably one of the best cameras of that year. We also had the iPhone XS and XS Max that came out shortly after this. We had, what other phones we had? We had the Samsung Galaxy S9 earlier that year, but this was probably one of the better phones of that time. This camera was solid. I think it had a lot of capability, and I'm trying to think what other phones came out that year, but this one probably had the best camera of that time, and that is beautiful. Again, having a phone like this with that type of capability, with that camera of that moment, was awesome. Now, the only thing I didn't really like too much about this phone, it didn't have an ultra-wide camera. I'm way more of a fan of ultra-wide cameras than, these types of sensors, but I don't think these cameras are bad by any means either. So not a big deal by any means, but it would have been kind of nice had we actually had, an ultra-wide camera here. But I will say, for standard application stuff that you're going to do, very decent camera. Like, it's really not that bad. but you're definitely going to be getting a better experience from like a Note 10, Note 20, those types of devices. Those are always going to be better, but I still love this camera and I still think it does the job for the most part. For basically everything you're going to do, I think you're going to be perfectly fine. So from that perspective, basically it's a thumbs up for me. Now in the software and the longevity portion, this is probably the one area or the main aspect of this phone that is not going to be holding up quite well. This phone pretty much kind of got discontinued with software a few years ago, and since then, I mean, this is kind of the issue that we're in. It's not really worth buying anymore because it's kind of at a standstill with software. We've gotten many versions of software after this thing. We've gotten basically One UI 3, One UI 4, One UI 5, and One UI 6 is going to be coming out this year in a beta and an official version sometime later this year. So this phone is severely outdated. You may get lucky and get some security updates here and there on this phone, but this is by far one of the main issues that you're going to run into if you kind of get a phone like this right now. So in terms of that, I would probably recommend staying away from this type of device from that perspective. Again, it's not a bad phone, it's good hardware, but the software, again, is just severely outdated when it comes down to it. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. Now, in terms of the performance of this phone, this device did have that Qualcomm Snapdragon 845 chipset inside of it with 6 gigs of RAM on the base model. It did go up to 8 gigs of RAM. My specific model did have 6 gigs of RAM, and as I've kind of mentioned before, I kind of do think that the performance of this phone at that moment was pretty decent, and even now, like, it's really not that bad, which is pretty insane. So I think that in and of itself is kind of one of the things to kind of keep in mind. Now, I will say, although this phone is still a 60 hertz panel, fairly older device, this is not a bad performing phone. It's just not a good performing phone because of the software. But when you look at this device, it is actually pretty insane of how good of a performing phone this was at that moment. I definitely do think, I'm more of a fan of the Samsung Galaxy Note 9, probably now seeing how it's aged than I was before, but everyone kind of knows that this is a very solid performing phone, and I think that's just kind of where we're at. But, if you're going to do basic things, if you're going to take it up a notch and do more intensive application testing or whatever, this is going to be perfectly fine. But I kind of do think that, because of the software, again, it kind of comes down to it, there's not really a massive point in picking up this phone because of that. So from that perspective, the performance could have been better, but, honestly, it's a pretty decent performing phone when it comes down to it. That thumbs up for me. Of course, it's not worth buying anymore, but it's still a decent performing phone. This thing also had a 4,000 milliamp hour battery inside of it, which was a massive size battery. So you also have to keep in mind that when you're getting a phone like this, you are getting solid performance. You're getting a pretty decent battery life inside of this thing. Now, it's definitely degraded over time, but again, one of those crazy things that this phone from that long ago had this type of battery size, which is honestly kind of, inspiring. I don't know if inspiring is the right word, but it's a good, battery size for sure. So to kind of sum up this video, what I'll tell you is I definitely do think the Note 9 was a very, very spectacular phone when it comes down to it. It was very solid, had a lot of capability. I just don't know if it's worth buying anymore. Like I've said, probably the last 2 years now, mostly because of the software. Because this thing has been outdated with software, it doesn't make too much sense to buy it. But I do think in this day and age, the hardware still holds up decently well. I think it still looks pretty good. It's just not really worth buying because of it being outdated in terms of the software standpoint. So in terms of that kind of covers it up here. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.